One on December 6th. It's Friday. This is hopefully our final meeting of our working group to look at a possibly final draft of the bill that we've been working on. And happy to have you all here. Thanks for coming. We can, if there are no questions or comments, we can jump right into overview of the changes made to the new draft. Anyone have anything they want to say before we jump in?
No, I think the draft bill gives us kind of a roadmap to discuss this and move through. I don't. Anyway, I'm okay with just going through the draft bill.
Wonderful. And I will welcome the I was going to say illustrious, but the wonderful John Gray, who is here, him, and he will take over the conversation. And John, how would you like to do this? You want to go through all of it and then we can ask questions and discuss, or should we ask questions as we go?
So, good morning, everyone. John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. I think what makes sense is I can do a really quick overview of the full set of changes without giving any detail. It should be super quick, just what's done in this draft. And I think at that point, we could just turn directly to the draft and go page by page and probably talk about the relevant sections as they come up. They're each pretty discrete pieces, so I think it's going to be simple to do without having bleed over and needing to jump between different sections.
John, I
So,
think it's a great idea. And I would just say when we do get to the question portion, if people could raise their virtual hand, then we can sort of be organized in how we continue the flow. All right, great. Go ahead, John. You have the floor.
perfect. So this draft makes, I would say, 7 changes. First is updating legislative intent. So that's that policy statement to align with task force recommendations and specify particular priorities. So first is updating legislative intent. The second piece is to require rulemaking on prioritization methodology and bonus incentive structures that align with that expressed legislative intent. And I'll explain why I think this kind of structuring can make sense rather than just a cabined focus that applies that legislative intent exclusively to those pieces. Third, sorry, go ahead.
John, I'm just wondering, are you at some point, are you gonna share the screen and have us?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yep. Yep, I'll do that. I just wanted to do the overview before we jump into the document. The third key change it makes is adding a new permissible use for the special fund dollars to the award of emergency aid. The fourth piece is that it adds a new eligibility condition for consolidation. It updates the relevant committees to recommend legislative appropriations. It adds the final application approval conditions, and it specifies that the aid award is in the form of a debt service subsidy and sets some parameters for that. With that, I will turn to sharing my screen, but hopefully that will help orient as we go through the document so you aren't wondering, why isn't this showing up here? Or are we just waiting to talk at another time? Can you guys see this? Awesome. So the first piece here is your updates to legislative intent. As you can see, this is a pretty substantial change from the prior draft. The previous draft focused on its first sentence focused on incentivizing construction, and the idea was to meet educational needs. It didn't talk much about efficient use of funds or streamlining state funds for particular purposes. What you see here updates that first line to say that it's the intent of this chapter to encourage the efficient use of public funds to modernize school infrastructure in alignment with current educational needs. That language is pulled directly from the task force recommendation that we talked about in the last meeting. And I'm happy to pause there if people had questions on switching from an approach to the old state aid program that encouraged renovation, additions, and constructions purely to meet educational needs. And the idea there seemed to be to encourage updates, whereas this is making it clear that a key focus of this isn't just encouraging those updates, but actually ensuring that it's an efficient use of state funds.
John, I have a general question that I see Alice's hand is up too. Um, what's the is there any teeth behind a statement of policy? Does it hold any weight in terms of, statutory follow through?
So it does matter. It's not the same as setting something in stone, right? But what this does is if there is a question as to how to interpret particular provisions, this is a nice place to look and see. And as you're going to see later when we come to the updated responsibilities related to rulemaking, that section expressly pulls in this legislative intent. So it will directly cabin some of the rulemaking authority and is meant to direct rulemaking on particular pieces in alignment with these standards. So it is not a toothless provision, is what I would say. There are intent expressions that don't mean much, like we'll see often in budgetary bills that folks want to put in language to say, is the intent of the legislator in the future to appropriate funds for these particular purposes? And it's just a 10-year plan, and it doesn't necessarily cabin people much. I think that this is stronger than that because it will help spell out what needs to be done in rulemaking. And again, it's a useful piece for courts to look at if there's a question as to how to interpret provisions within this chapter.
Thank you so much, John. Let's go Alice, Jill, and then Senator Weeks. Sorry, Representative Emmons. Joe Briggs.
No, that's fine. You can call me Alice. It's fine. We're in Title 16, Section 3440. And that, I'm just concerned that the language, I know what we're trying to address, but could this language, and I know it's a statement of policy, it's going to be carried out further in rulemaking, could it be interpreted that these dollars for debt service that we're saying would help with school construction could be used for operating costs, or could be used for planning to go into consolidation and how you operate the consolidation of schools and not physical construction?
So I do think the other pieces of the program will spell out the actual what dollars can go to. And so I don't think that this section would particularly call that out. If you're concerned about the specific language in this first sentence and the ambiguity of modernizing school infrastructure, I would read modernizing school infrastructure to be a focus on physical facilities beyond operation. So that's just my personal read of it, but maybe a question for the group if that seems inappropriate. I don't see that as a problem, that like if we're trying to ensure that funds go to physical buildings, facilities, rather than operation costs, I don't think there's language in the current setup that's drafted here to say that that's going to happen. But maybe,
I'm just worried about about interpretation when it gets out of our little world, how that might be interpreted, because I think our goal is that it would go just towards the construction, the actual physical change in a building or upgrades of the building.
and so
not anything ancillary to that per se.
Right. And if you think about how the application process works, which is about those construction projects, and that the funding is directed and is responsive to the bond approval for those projects, it's hard for me to envision how percentages that are tied to those bond approvals and bonds that are for the construction costs would go beyond that. But if that is a concern, I don't think that that's something you would address today. I think that would be built out as the program goes. And I don't see any concerns as of today that that's a real risk.
Right, thank you.
So Martine, to your question about whether or not legislative intent, is something that's really taken and is used, I guess, is the question, and creates boundaries. John, I would agree with you. Sometimes legislative intent is very vague, but this actually is, I was looking at this, and when I read it, I thought, yes, that is, if we are building out prioritization metrics and rules, these give us the framework within which to do that work. And I will tell you just from experience on the agency side that we frequently will say, let's go back to the bill. What was the legislative intent? And then we actually use that as our sort of our guardrails in essence. So I was going to say, John, thank you for this language. This to me is very workable from an implementation point of view and gives us kind of the roadmap for how we would then develop rules and prioritization.
Yeah, and I would love to hear, I know David has a question, but I'd love to hear, because I think some of this language was stuff that I came up with, and John was really good about grasping it. But I would love to hear if folks like this language and if it seems like what we're going for. I mean, it does to me, obviously, but I'd love to hear from other folks as well. David, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add in from a LCAR perspective that it's nowadays it's very helpful to have legislative intent written in if it's well written, and I think this is fairly well written. I also wanted to comment that the reality is that this bill will hit the two education committees, the money committees, the chambers, and it's going to change 1,000 times between now and the time it's actually passed. But I think this is a very good start from an LCAR perspective. Thank you.
So I might also offer, and this I was going to address when we got to the rulemaking specific piece, but part of what I think is advantageous about including this in a general statement of policy is that you can think of it as applying not just to guiding the agency as they're considering rulemaking, but to anyone who looks to this piece. So if a district is looking to put together a project, they can look to this language to see what sorts of things they should be thinking about as they build out that project. So the general applicability of the section is kind of a direction to anyone looking at this chapter. And I think it's nice to have something broader than just a targeted focus on these priorities should apply to rulemaking. So the next piece here is, sorry.
In terms of the language that's here, I just had a question about, it's just a silly grammatical question, but at the end there, 21st century learning standards, statewide enrollment trends, and capacity and scale that support best educational practices. Does it make more sense to say statewide enrollment trends, comma, capacity and scale that support best education practices?
I think.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So I thought explicitly about this question, and as the discussion happened, I guess 2 weeks ago, it sounded like capacity and scale were intertwined concerns. So I thought of them as kind of dual pieces. Like if you have full enrollment at a school, that's what we're talking about with capacity, whereas scale would be, are we serving the needs of a whole community, kind of consolidation related. So I thought of those as intertwined concerns that would both be informed and that are meant to support best educational practices. That said, this is definitely not my bailiwick. So if the group feels that these should be ordered in a way where they're thought of as distinct concerns, that makes complete sense to me. I just understood from the discussion that you couldn't really talk about capacity without talking about scale, and you couldn't talk about scale without talking about capacity. But if it's more complicated than that, that seems completely right to change it.
I mean, I'm fine with that. I have been using capacity and scale together almost as, a package. But I wanted to make sure other folks are okay with that. And my other question is, and this is maybe a question for Jill, is there a general sense of what 21st century learning standards are? And is that a term we should be using?
So the answer is yes. And there seemed to be a bit of confusion last year that this was like an amorphous kind of thing. It's not. There's actually a lot of research and, like evidence-based kind of practice in terms of school construction. So it's, I can give you some examples, but it's a pretty well-documented set of practices in school construction. So things like, these are just, it's a short list, but there's a lot more, right? Including, as you all like to say in statute, things like flex space. is something that is seen a lot in 21st century school buildings, right? So this idea that you might have team teaching going on and you need group spaces to be able to bring kids in, but then also they may need one-on-one space over here. You may actually have, like during COVID, it would have been great if we had flex space, right? So that you could actually do social distancing. So buildings that are flexible for a variety of uses to address kind of modern approaches to teaching and learning. Another kind of principle of 21st century learning is natural light. So having a lot of natural light in our buildings, we see that in some of our newer buildings, and you can like feel it when you're in those buildings. There's a lot of evidence and research to support that improves student learning. And then other things like the building as a learning space itself. So there are some buildings that will do things like they're actually teaching lessons about efficiency and the use of energy by actually like using the building as a teaching tool. So these are all part of 21st century learning. Those were just some examples, but I do think there's this idea that we don't know what this is. We actually do. We're pretty clear on what this is, and there's lots and lots of evidence. And this goes back to this idea of one of the tasks that we have at the state level is to get sort of a stable of kind of pre-qualified folks that do school construction. That would actually be one of our things that we would be looking for as we're pre-qualifying architects, engineers, and construction folks is, do they have experience in 21st century, and can they like demonstrate that through projects that they've done?
All right, thank you, Jill. And maybe Erin can add that to the list of things that the committees will kind of unpack. It's important.
Yeah, on that point though, I wonder if, because I had a similar question, does it need to say 21st century learning standards for facilities? Because I immediately went to, are we talking grad standards? Are we talking academic standards? Are we talking Common Core? Nitpicky, but that makes a lot of sense, Jill. I just wonder if we need to spell that out right here. So 21st century learning standards for whatever the right terminology is, facilities, school buildings.
That makes sense to me.
Thank you.
Jill, does that make sense? Or do you see all of it sort of interesting?
No, I think it actually does make sense, because what Erin's referencing is actually a whole very specific set of learning and teaching practices that in an ideal world should be reflected in school construction, but you can do that without a flex space, right? So I do think 21st century, instead of learning standards, building standards or something like that, just a little wordsmithing there, John, makes sense.
Would you guys prefer 21st century
Alice
building
disagrees
standards?
vehemently.
Yeah, I wouldn't say 21st century building standards.
Yeah, I know, it needs something, yeah.
I liked what Erin said, and I think that really clarifies my first concern, that our dollars are gonna go to construction and not operating infrastructure, whatever it may be, or learning issues. And I liked what Erin proposed. I think it made sense.
21st century standards for school facilities or for best practices in school facilities. Whatever the right terminology is, but just to be clear, yeah.
Yeah, that you can connect it to the building.
Yes.
Is it
Yeah, because I
still,
didn't immediately make that connection.
is it still 21st century learning standards for school facilities? Do you still need learning in there to make clear? It sounds like this is a discrete set of practices.
Yeah.
And that I can change this to 21st century standards for schools facilities if that is equally clear. I just thought that.
Jill, do you have a specific
I went
phrase
to
that's
the
sort of
Google.
used in the
Yeah, I
field?
went to the Google machine because I was like, I know it was like on the edge of my brain. I know that we've used this phrase. So it's 21st century education facilities standards.
Awesome.
And that helpfully actually comes from the Department of Defense, who has pioneered most of this work. So it's their language, which is great.
And I run a Department of Defense.
Okay, so I can make that update. The only other change here, which isn't highlighted because it's a deletion in the final sentence of this section 1, It said that joint construction projects between 2 or more school districts where feasible and educationally appropriate are also encouraged. I removed the also because I think of that as part of these same concerns. So I didn't want it to suggest that they like negatively imply that that wasn't a consideration under statewide enrollment trends and capacity and scale. Not a huge substantive change, but just wanted to make clear that these all tie together. It's not a series of discrete intents that are separate and apart from each other. They're meant to inform each other. If folks are good with this, I will jump down to the next section. So the next piece you see is we're talking about agency responsibilities under the program. On our first line, adopting rules pertaining to school construction and capital outlay, including rules to specify a point prioritization methodology and a bonus incentive structure aligned with the legislative intent expressed in Section 3440. So this is calling out both that those tasks need expressly to be done. I know there was some discussion at the end of last meetings about we've assumed as background that this would be a debt service subsidy with prioritization and bonus incentives, but it hadn't expressly been called out. So this is expressly tasking with rulemaking on those two pieces and saying they need to be done, keeping those standards that we just discussed in mind. So the next piece, we can jump down to the special fund, which is down here on page 8, adding a new permissible use of funds. I think there was broad agreement in the group last meeting to add emergency aid as a fourth permissible use. And I see Senator Weeks has a question.
If I could, because I think we're kind of passing through the bill from front to back without trying to retread. So if I can we go back to page 3, line 1 and 2? There's a comment about procedures designed to reduce borrowing. I'm just curious what the intent was for the reduce borrowing phrase. Where'd that come from? What's the idea? I'm not objecting to it. I just don't understand it.
So I believe that this language came from Rhode Island. If you recall, in the early discussions when you guys were just discussing a governance draft, there had been a set of responsibilities. This list is meant to capture existing responsibilities related to programs and then also pull in pieces from Rhode Island. So that's kind of the extent of my awareness of where the language comes from. This would also be something that the advisory board is meant to inform on. So this, yes, it's sort of broad, but I think the idea is to ensure that the program over time is being kept in check.
Okay. I just wanted to comment that already built into the draft AOE responsibilities with a series of gates and a series of reviews, and there's already a balance. I'm not objecting to the sentence, but I just feel it's kind of redundant. It doesn't really offer anything we don't already know. That's all.
So can I offer what I think this might be, but you're right, Dave, it's a bit vague. Here's what I think it might translate to in terms of actual activities that the agency might do. So, 2 places that I could see this. One would be the agency really suffers from and actually the state generally suffers from a lack of staff who have a really good, deep knowledge of all of the different federal programs that exist that could actually support school construction, renovation, modernization. So there's a range of things out there, and I will tell you very much from personal experience, both at the agency and then also in these like kind of interagency task force groups, there is nobody who has a handle on this kind of thing, and it makes it really challenging for us to actually support schools. So for example, there is a tax credit for energy efficiency. I think that right now, the folks who have the best handle on that is the bond bank. There's nobody in the agency that has a handle on that. We can't support folks in this. When the Department of Energy has put out a whole series of grants, I've signaled multiple times that we, within the Agency of Education, our expertise, really by design, is in Department of Education and to a lesser extent USDA funding streams. And you have to learn a whole new set of things, EPA, Department of Energy. So all that to say, I think that what this is calling out is that one of our tasks would be at the agency to, and then I think again at the higher state level, is to be able to support districts in a better understanding of all of the options available to sort of what I call braid funds or braid kind of different programs to actually reduce the amount that they have to bond for. And we just don't have that at all right now. And so this would be part of our task, but we would also be having a resource for it as well.
Thank you, Jill. Yep,
I
Senator,
get it.
okay
Yeah,
with
if
that?
I could just make one comment.
Yeah, I just think redundancy is something that's often baked into legislation, but go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I just as written, the statement's kind of counterintuitive. Here we're developing a system for borrowing, but we're outlining the fact that we're trying to reduce borrowing. I get it. I just wanted an explanation for what the intent of the sentence was. So I'm okay with it. We can move on. Thank you.
The one last thing I might add on redundancy is just I would draw a distinction between pieces of the program that are expressly cabining and restricting the availability of funds with this language that's talking about the development of policies and procedures. So I do think of it as like informing program, but it sounds like there's agreement on this piece. So I can also just for the group, I can slow down in scrolling through pages if you would like for me to go page by page rather than update by update.
I think that might be helpful because we're trying to get to a final vote today. So just so that we're clear on what we're
Sure.
voting on,
Sure.
at least like on a page by page level, questions at that page, and then let's move to the next one.
We can do that, John. I am going to propose, if it works for everyone, that any changes that will be made, I'm hoping that we can get a final draft and we can all stay on the Zoom and vote for it this morning, if that's like physically possible to do. So yeah, please feel free. We can go through page by page, high level. I'm assuming and expecting that everyone did look it over and has a good sense of what's happening on each page, but yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I'll just jump back up to page 1 to make sure that we're catching anything folks want to raise. So we've talked about statement of policy. We've talked about the program in the past. I didn't get the sense there was any disagreement on initial assignment of responsibilities. We've talked about this updated rulemaking language. Additional responsibilities that the agency would be tasked with in this program, including that annual school construction funding request as part of its budget, developing pre-qualification and review process, providing technical assistance to school districts, supervisory unions, general contractors, maintaining a current list of school construction projects that have received approval, final approval, priority points. On page 3, collecting and maintaining those quarterly progress reports. We just talked about the recommended policies and procedures designed to reduce borrowing, conducting a needs survey. This is language that the committee has previously discussed and worked through. Developing a formal enrollment projection model. I believe that in our last meeting, you guys resolved that it was fine to retain this language. Encouraging school districts and supervisory unions to investigate opportunities for the maximization of space. Collecting and maintaining a clearinghouse of prototypical school plans, retaining consultants. Yes.
And Madam Chairs, if I could ask a question here. Again, I don't need to review every paragraph, but when I read through the document and I had questions, I'm just going to kind of sequentially go through. So page 3, John just brought up line 11, line 12. Prototype school designs. I understand the intent, but there's a cost to developing prototype designs. And I submit that the reality is we're going to be taking existing schools potentially right sizing the school, bringing them together and adding additions to existing facilities as opposed to building brand new schools. Again, I understand the intent, but I also want everyone to understand that requiring the development of prototype school designs is in and of itself a cost to the program that I don't think we need unless we really need it. So mandating it, I'm not sure is necessary, but I would welcome Jill's feedback on whether this is a really necessary requirement as opposed to a suggestive approach to the new schools.
Yeah, Dave, you raise a good point. And thank you for that. Because you're right, it is a body of work and there is a cost associated with that. John, is there a softening of this language that would not make it a mandated sort of and required task that we have to fund and resource?
So the agency could do this in the absence of it being a mandated task. But obviously it would just be sort of a understanding between the legislature and the agency that that's what's happening. You could make this conditional on a number of things, right? Like if what you see is that the influx of requests is just renovation and that prototypes are not going to help, it could be like if appropriate. You could add something just as easily as if
like an
appropriate.
if appropriate or something that just kind of softens it up. I mean, I think that it is likely, given the nature, like the inquisitive kind of professionalism of staff that would be working on this program, that they would likely do that. But Dave, you're right. It does create a requirement that we do so. And that it be right-sized for Vermont in some ways, which is also always challenging.
Erin has her hand up, but I mean, Dave, to your point about the cost of maintaining a, clearinghouse, there's also the cost of having architects design, boutique schools all across the state. And I just think we need to consider that as well.
Yeah, no, I get that. I understand that there will be some new schools, but I submit that the majority of the efforts will be extensions on existing facilities. And I just want everybody to recognize designing new schools is a big number. And if we find that we don't need to have that clearinghouse of designs, that we don't mandate it, but to Jill's point, we obviously give AOE the opportunity to create such a prototype design if in fact it's necessary, but not required. That's all.
I really appreciate Senator Weeks's point here and kind of lean the same direction. I mean, we're just not in a place where we're going to be building tons of schools. If we're building regional high schools, it might be a couple. So I'm comfortable with taking it out, but I'm also looking back on page 2, line 4, and wondering if there's a way to pull those together, in essence, to say that, can we hopefully if we're honing in on some consultants and architects that sort of specialize in this, that we're also getting some efficiency out of that maybe, oh, this project looks like something we did in this part. Could we do something similar here? I don't know if there's a way to sort of gently say that there, if there's enough, just that the AOE could do this on their own. Certainly we want to save money and be realistic. And we're not going to be in a factory mode production of schools, unfortunately. So I don't know how much is really needed here, but I'm kind of erring towards what Senator Weeks is saying.
Yeah, go ahead, and then Alice, please.
Yeah. Erin, I think you're onto something there. John, I actually was gonna say just a super minor edit now that I looked at that again. It should say pre-K through 12. That's going to be really important for our universal pre-K.
Sorry, which line are you on?
On the pre-qual section on page 2.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay.
Yep.
Specializing in pre-K.
Yeah.
That's actually a conforming thing we probably need to double check throughout, that this should always reference pre-K through 12.
That's a great point. Go ahead, Alice.
So I'm back on the prototype. And I just want some clarity. Are we also, I think we talked at our last meeting about kind of submitting, when the bill is submitted to our standing committees, we would also be submitting a letter saying, you know, we looked at this, there needs to be further discussion. We're still doing that, right? So I'm wondering, with this prototype language, we did this in the construction world, in my world, with our state police barracks. And I think it was BGS, I don't think it was the Department of Public Safety, that developed a prototype for all of those buildings. And it might be worth in our letter to make reference to check with BGS and Department of Public Safety in terms of how they address this internally and what the cost was and who holds those documents and who did the work. Because we did that a number of years ago. And going forward, it really helps in the construction of those buildings because we have that prototype already in place. You can shrink it, you can add to it, but at least you've got the structure. So I'm just wondering if there's a way that we could incorporate that in our letter to do some, where to look, because it's already been done. Just a thought.
Thank you, Alice. Aaron, maybe can you add that? Yeah, thanks. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, so is there agreement? It sounds like at least making the update to specializing in pre-K through grade 12, checking to see if any conforming changes are agreed changes. Did you want to just maintain the clearinghouse language? Did you want to add if appropriate or as appropriate, or did you want to delete that entirely and assume that it's just going to be done if it's helpful to the program?
I think if you can soften that language a little bit, as appropriate or as needed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Everyone okay with that?
Yeah, I'm good with that. I'd appreciate that change. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. I think the last piece here, last responsibility, submitting written reports regarding the status of the program. With that, we can jump to the advisory board. I'll just go slowly in case there are questions, but I don't have to read this aloud if folks don't want to hear language that they've heard a million times before.
Yeah, if I, Madam Chair, if I could. General comment on the advisory board. Again, I'm just going to reiterate that I don't support the establishment of an advisory board. I think that the AOE should be charged with the responsibilities which are clearly outlined in the draft, and I think those are appropriate. If you go into the advisory board section, the advisory board has the same responsibilities almost verbatim as the AOE. And I understand there's, you know, it's designed to be kind of a balance, but I think the AOE should be charged with the responsibilities that are outlined. An advisory board is not necessary. Here we're replacing the State Board of Education's kind of advisory role and creating a new board. And I'm not going to kill the bill or vote against the bill, but I don't think it's necessary from the get-go. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Dave. Yeah, my understanding is the state board, it wasn't really an advisory position. They actually had a greater role in all of this, but I guess I would submit that we leave it for now and then allow the committees to dive into it a little bit more, take testimony, and just, you know, see where folks want to head. Is everyone okay with that? Alice?
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
Yeah, Alice is struggling a little.
I'm okay with that, but I think with the really, once it gets into the standing committees, I think they really need to vet what the current role is of the State Board of Education and whether or not we need this advisory board. I think it's good to keep the advisory board in here. Again, the bill is kind of a starting point. And I think it'll be up to our standing committees to do that deeper dive.
Would it change? I hear all that and I can reflect that in the draft letter from us. Would it change anything if you go to page 7, line 9, about, this is kind of my favorite part of this section in some ways, is that the development of a long-term vision for a statewide capital plan in accordance with needs and projected funding. That feels more unique to the advisory board, especially because we're talking about like statewide bonding capacity and things, and not just to the AOE. So I don't know if moving that in some ways under kind of sort of the duties or purpose even of the advisory board has any merit, or if we've overcomplicated it, and we can again flesh that out in committees in the session.
I'm fine keeping that where it is for now, but happy to entertain other thoughts.
Just if I can piggyback on Representative Brady's comment, I agree completely. And that's the problem with developing this board and giving them power or responsibilities to create things such as the long-term vision. I think the long-term vision, that's AOE. That's all about AOE. And to muddy it with an advisory board, I just don't think it's appropriate. But again, to Representative Brady's point, this is going to go, or Representative Emmons' point, this is going to go into committee and it's going to get all chewed up and it's going to come out, quite different. So anyway, I just wanted to put on the table that I think that some of the language in here, just like that comment about vision, it's again kind of counterintuitive, disperses responsibility. It's not appropriate.
Okay, John, ready to keep
Sure.
going?
Yep. Jumping back up to page 4, we have our membership. A lot of procedural pieces here. Specification.
John, before you go on, if I can ask on membership, I just wanted to clarify that the 2 members appointed by the speaker and the 2 members appointed by the committee and committees, is the intent to be political appointments or non-political, like politicians or non-politicians? And I think it needs to be clear one way or the other.
So you're correct to identify that there's no language here specifying whether they have to be or are not permitted to be legislative members. I think the sole qualification we have here is expertise in particular pieces. So education, construction, real estate, finance. I don't frankly know what the group's intention is. If I did not read this to mean that there is an intent for this to be legislative members appointed, I took this to mean it would be choosing from someone who has expertise. If they happen to be a legislative member, that could be a factor in it, but that's not the read that I have. But you're certainly right to identify there's nothing spelled out to prohibit or specify.
Okay, that's funny because in my mind, I guess I assumed if they're being appointed by the pro tem and the speaker, or the committee on committees and the speaker, that they would be legislative folks, but that's not necessarily the case.
No, and I mean, if you see the language in sub
Yeah.
B at the bottom of page 4, it's from the general public. So this is a broad bucket from which to draw. And the qualification is these expertises that they would possess.
And we actually go on to say one represents a supervisory union and one is an educator. So that's not likely to be a legislator. I guess it could be, but.
Right.
Okay. Great. Dave, does that answer your question?
Yes and no. I mean, I read it the same way you guys are reading it. I have the same questions you guys had as you're reading it. I was wondering what the committee's thought was on whether it should be political or non-political involvement. in those particular paragraphs about the assignment by the speaker and the assignment by the committee of committees.
Go ahead, Rep. Emmons.
I would really lean that they are not political appointments. This is an advisory to the Agency of Education. If you put politicians on that, it's gonna change the whole dynamic. So I would really recommend that we're very clear, it is not standing members of the General Assembly. Because you're gonna change the whole tone, and also, you know, we have legislative intent. And some is to be carried out by this advisory group as well as AOE. And then you put 4 legislators or 2 legislators on that, you've got this meshing of legis.
All right, how do people feel about explicitly, depoliticizing these appointments? Are folks okay with that?
Yeah, I am. I would agree with Rep. Emmons. I don't think it should be a political appointment.
Okay, John, why don't we make that, unless you don't think it needs to be more explicit than it already is, but if it does, then let's make that change.
So what I might suggest is just that to leave this as is today, because I think that this is saying general public. I agree, it doesn't expressly prohibit. So what I might do is just talk to folks in my office and see if they feel comfortable that general public is sufficiently prescriptive to exclude, because it does seem the intent is not to appoint legislative members, but I take general public to encompass everyone, so I can see a conceivable world in which you incidentally end up with someone, a legislative member. So to me, I think the language is safe for today's vote, and I have this down as a note that it would be something to think about if it has to be strengthened to make even clearer that this should not be, like that there should be an express prohibition.
Wonderful. Dave, you have a hand up again.
I do. Yeah, I would just like to submit that it be expressly drafted to be non-political or a non-politician. That's just my input if we're gonna go down one path or the other.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Yep.
Yeah, I should make clear where my comment is coming from, which is mainly being new. That's mainly where my comment comes from. So I wouldn't want to create redundant language, but I can certainly add that if there's appetite from the group.
Chris? Taylor?
Yeah, not to stay too long on this, these couple sentences, but I'm getting a little tripped up with the expertise in education or construction, real estate or finance, and one of whom shall be an educator. When we say in education or construction, and then we say real estate or finance, are we looking for somebody that has just one of those expertise, or are we looking at somebody who has, to me, it reads almost like we're looking for somebody who has education or construction, so one of those two, and then real estate or finance, and also one of those two. But I don't know, I might just be misreading that, but it's tripping me up a little bit.
So I can maybe respond to this. I read it as education or construction, real estate, or finance, but in any case, the ors make it optional. So you could have expertise in education, or you could be someone who's in the construction, real estate, or finance space. But if you are in the construction, real estate, or finance space, it doesn't mean that you have to have construction plus real estate plus finance. On the previous comment, I helpfully got a text from Beth saying that it's not uncommon to add that express prohibition. So I can add that in.
Wonderful. Go ahead, John.
Okay. Let's jump down to specification of terms. I'll just pause here if there's any. This is fairly standard procedural pieces. 4-year terms, how to fill in the event of an unexpected vacancy, no more than 2 consecutive terms, members with term limits. Obviously, those ex officio members are serving by virtue of their role. Duties. So this is a purely advisory board advising on those rules. project priorities, proposed legislation to enhance the program, policies and procedures for reducing borrowing, which is language that's been discussed a little bit in the context of agency responsibilities, development of that projection model, procedures for applications, collection and maintenance of those prototypical school plans. So if there are changes that happen, since we're adding as appropriate language to what's done for the agency responsibilities, I don't think we have to make an update here because this is in advisory capacity, so we would necessarily pick up that as appropriate language. Determination of eligible cost components, which is not something that the group has spent much time on at this point. That long-term vision, I'll pause here because I know there was some discussion earlier about development of that long-term vision. Maintenance of data on facilities, advising on use of needs survey, and encouraging opportunities for maximal utilization of space.
Alice, Rep. Emmons?
So John, I just need some clarity. So if you can scroll back to, I believe it's number 1, dealing with the rules.
Mhm.
So the board's going to advise AOE. AOE is the one that is going to be promulgating the rules, correct?
Yes.
The advisory committee is going to advise pertaining to these rules.
That's right.
And then our creation of the board, which is in beginning of section 3, says that the board would advise the agency and it looks like the board is going to do the adoption of the rules because it says including the adoption of the rules. So does the advisory board adopt those rules?
No, the agency is the entity adopting the rules. And I'm just pulling up the language here. So we're on page 4.
Okay.
There's hereby created the board. And I'm sorry, I'm in Winooski, so there are jets flying over.
No, we don't hear them.
Oh, good. Okay. I hear them.
Yeah.
Hereby created the board, which shall advise the agency on implementation of the program in accordance with the provisions of this chapter, including the adoption of rules, setting of statewide priorities. This is just calling out clearly that the board is meant to advise on that rule process. And it's very loud for me.
Okay, I just wanted the clarity on that.
I think you're safe here if the concern is that somehow they're assuming a more gatekeeping function like the earlier drafts contemplated. Were there other questions on any of the advisory duties of the board? Procedural, this is related to meetings, has the assistance of the Agency of Education, compensation reimbursement.
Senator Weeks?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment again, it's maybe a reiteration of what I said a few moments ago, but the duties under the advisory board, they're just like almost a carbon copy of the duties of AOE. And, for example, page 6, line 11, the collection and maintenance of a clearinghouse of prototype plans, to me, it looks like a cut and paste. And that if we really create this advisory board, we don't need a duplicate set of responsibilities and duties. We need to know exactly what the advisory board is supposed to do, and the collection and maintenance of prototype designs, it has no value. That's AOE's responsibility. And that's the problem with the way the advisory board duties are written. Is it's just kind of, to me, it looks like a cut and paste, and we really need to dedicate the responsibility to one or the other. That's all.
May I respond to this?
Yep.
Yeah, so my thinking there is you could have generic language here that doesn't pick, you're right to say copy paste. These are meant to capture the same duties. So you could have alternative language here that says board advises on implementation of program, but then it would be unclear in statute the extent to which they have to advise on particular duties. So the reason the duties are spelled out and are duplicative is it's meant to make clear that the agency does have these duties, and these are required pieces that the board would need to advise on. So that's the reason it looks duplicative. If you didn't have that specificity, it might be unclear whether the board actually needs to advise on development of a projection model or the like. That said, you could elect to specify only particular things that you think are of importance and have the board just advise on those particular pieces. But that's the reason, at least for the drafting style that's done in these two sections.
Thanks, John. Jill?
Yeah, so Dave, I think you're onto something. Because as John, as you noted at the bottom, it says the AOE will advise on these things, right? So there's a certain circularity when it comes to the technical elements of this, where like we know how this actually works in real life, and we should sort of acknowledge that, is that if the agency has the technical expertise to develop things like the enrollment model, then what they're really doing is they're going up to the advisory board, they're saying, this is our enrollment model, and then you actually don't necessarily have the technical experts on the advisory board to weigh in a thoughtful and meaningful way. So I think, Dave, what you're pointing to is, and you and I have a bit of a disagreement in that I do think we need an advisory board, but what is it that we actually care about that this board is advising on? It's likely not a lot of these really technical elements. That's the nuts and bolts of like running a program. It is, I'm going to posit here that what we care about is that this board is actually advising on things like the prioritization metrics, the bonus share, eligible cost, the maximum square footage, that kind of thing, which is also, by the way, a pretty technical thing, but likely is something I would say that, folks should weigh in on. So I understand where you're going here, Dave. I think we actually do need the advisory board on those things, because that is where the rubber hits the road. That's the money. And I do think that's a collective, you've heard me say it, I do think that's a collective decision point. So knowing that we're on the last day, do we want to try to say strike? Do we want to say leave it all in, but this then goes into the letter and says, this is all the duties of the advisory board. Our recommendation is that we pare this down to what we actually care about. Or do we put the really general language in that John was talking about, which makes me very nervous because the management of a giant construction program is very technical, and I don't think we actually want the advisory board with their hands in it. So those are my thoughts. But Dave, I think you're getting to something important here.
Aaron?
I'm probably talking myself in circles and changing my mind as we go here, but I agree a lot with Jill that we don't need all the minutia potentially here of the advisory board. They're not duplicating the work of AOE. Its power is the big stuff, the incentives, the priorities, and the sort of looking at the big picture, the vision, not for education as a whole, but the vision for how we're spending our dollars physically on buildings in the state. Then that leads me to a second, which is those are actually quite political. And so I was totally on board with the no legislators, except that I think those are, that's our budget. Those are the things the legislators will have to decide. And so now I'm helping not at all, because I'm questioning myself on if that's what the advisory board's doing, and it's the big hard stuff and the money decisions or how we're going to prioritize funding, that actually might need political appointees. That's not helpful, but that's my honest thought.
Alice?
Well, the budget's going to be, the thinking is that the governor would submit a line item budget for those districts that are ready to go. That's where you make your decision, where the money goes. It's done on the legislative end. None of those dollars can be appropriated until the legislature acts. So the governor is going to be submitting the governor's proposal with an item for the debt piece, whatever that may be, for the cash fund. And the legislature would receive the list, supposedly, of what districts those are gonna go towards. So that's where the legislature weighs in. And they can change the list,
Is there a way? Okay, so then,
whether you like it or not, they can, the legislature can, if they so choose, to change the list.
I get so
Should
stuck
do
on this. Doesn't it specifically prohibit them from doing so? So wouldn't they have to change the statute that would
No.
give them the permission to do so?
No. All you need to do is say notwithstanding the statute.
Okay, but do we have a notwithstanding? Oh, okay, I got you. So they could do that during session, Alice. So they could say, here's the statute. It clearly says we shouldn't do this, but we're gonna put something in the BAA or in the big bill that says notwithstanding this thing that it says we are absolutely not supposed to do, we're going to do it.
Mhm.
Okay.
That's right.
I will be
It's done in
prepared
session
to
law.
remind folks. That as you can tell, this one just makes me bonkers.
Well, welcome to the legislative world.
Let's let John weigh in on that. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's right. It's done in session law, so it's done actively as the appropriations are being made, and it's very simple, just a notwithstanding clause, and that's dealt with. It's done in so many different spaces too. If you think about even the way the property taxes are set, the yield bill is notwithstanding the in statute rates every single year. So you're right to identify that it's hard to bind the legislature when the legislature decides the laws. So I was there an appetite to make changes to this section, or are people just noting that as this moves to session, there might be a condensing of the list of functions here? If you're wanting to do something today, I would need to know specifically which pieces you want to eliminate.
Go ahead, Dave, and then I think Alice.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment. Yeah, I think that we can keep the list as is. I just wanted to register a couple hesitations. I've done that. This will again get changed 1,000 times before it becomes law.
And what I wanted to say, I think Aaron mentioned that in the letter that will be submitted is to really look at the roles of the State Board of Education and the advisory board as well. Just kind of, you know, reflect our conversation here. So I think this is just going to change once it goes through the process.
Alice, can I ask a follow-up? What do you mean by examine the rules of the State Board of Ed?
Well, I was understanding what Aaron mentioned, that, you know, this is an advisory board and we're putting it out there, but also what Dave is saying, you know, some of the duties of the State Board of Education, are we taking away some of those duties with the school construction format that we're putting in, as well as this advisory board? As well, the advisory board is just duplicative of the work that the Agency of Ed is doing. So I think it's just kind of putting a flag there and saying, let's really look at all these roles, the current roles, and then what we're proposing to change.
Yeah, I thank you for that. I do want to remind folks that we took testimony from the state board saying that they do not have the resources nor the capacity to you know, be the front runners on this program. So they kind of, you know, gave up any kind of jurisdiction over this program as far as I'm concerned. But thank you for that, Alice. And Dave and then Aaron.
Yeah, I had if I could, two questions. First, just the comment that was just made about kind of circumvent or changing the role of the State Board of Education. They clearly indicated that they were not resourced for this type of effort, but at the same time, we're creating a new organization that may not be properly resourced to do the same thing. So I just, to Representative Edmonds' point, this is going to wash out in committee on who should be doing, who really has what role, AOE, advisory boards, State Board of Education, et cetera. And I'm okay with what we've drafted and we're putting forth. But the reality is that the State Board of Education was undersourced. This advisory committee may also be undersourced, and we have to deal with that concept so that if there's a counterbalance to the AOE, that we determine what that is and how to properly resource the counterbalance. Okay. That said, I just want to leave that. But my real question here was, there have been several references to a letter going in, and I've dropped track on what that letter is all about. What's the nature of the letter? Who's it go to? What's the content?
Dave, you were not here when I think the day that we started to encourage, and Aaron took it over, but a list of items that we've been discussing in this committee that we will send to the education committees to delve into further, knowing that we are bound by time and that we can't do all of this work here. So I think Aaron's been really thoughtful and well organized in keeping track of everything that we've discussed that will go to the committees. Okay.
So my intent, can I jump in right here now? My intent, I'm keeping this big messy list, but I will formulate it into a narrative that I'll share via email with all of us on the committee. This wouldn't be like some formal document we have to vote on and adopt, but is a sort of working document that we can use to make sure the House and Senate Ed committees have it, and as necessary, maybe money committees or others. So I'll share hopefully by the end of next week, once we kind of get through today. Again, this will be a narrative of like, here's some things that we just didn't get to, or here's some discussions that we had, things that were unresolved, things, that we went back and forth on, so that we don't have to start from scratch in the committees of jurisdiction. So I'll share, again, I'll share that draft. It's not meant to be like we unanimously agree on all these things, but sort of a explanation of our discussion almost to accompany the bill when it lands in committees, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Aaron. It's 20 of 10. I suggest we keep moving on, Dave, unless it's urgent.
Well, it's urgent enough, because the concept of a letter it's new to me. So to Representative Brady's point, I do think that the balance of influence between AOE, State Board of Education, and this advisory board needs to be one of the line items in that letter. Just requires more thought, and that I'll leave it at that.
I'm going to jump back in now. So we've gone through duties, meetings. We've talked previously about the prospect of repeal. So this is a sunsetting of the board 10 years out. And now we come to the next actual changes in this draft, which is to the special fund. This was adding as a new permissible use, awarding emergency aid. I think this is where we got when we were just going directly through the edits, and I didn't hear any objections to this piece. So the next substantial changes here, the real last changes, are in this approval and funding of school construction projects section. Just to remind the group, this is what mirrors existing section 3448. So if after this meeting or before session, you're hoping to look to compare and get a sense for how changes have been made, a comparison between 3445 and 3448 is useful for those purposes. You're going to see a lot looks the same. So contemplates a preliminary application. We've talked about this in the approval process in previous meetings. The piece that came up, oh, I'm going to pause.
Yeah, just a question. So my copy seems a little out of sync of yours, but I'm on page 9, and the comment, the question is, on my copy, it's line 14, statewide education initiatives. It's a little vague from my perspective. I'm wondering that statewide educational initiatives, or do we really mean the vision that's being created by the AOE for statewide education?
So I think this was something that was actually discussed at the last meeting, at which I think you weren't in attendance. This previously had said statewide educational initiatives plus state board vision. Given that there were concerns around the lack of an explicit state board vision and concerns around funding sufficient to generate that language was dropped, but there wasn't an appetite, and group, please correct me if I'm wrong, there wasn't an appetite to drop that entire concern for educational initiatives factoring into the application process.
It was also Dave, it was also an acknowledgement that there's things like the Commission on the Future of Education, and there's like the Pre-K Committee, and there's all of this other, we didn't want to name them, right? Because who knows? So it was generally the creation of a statewide vision for education.
Yeah, basically a concession to the practicality that there isn't an existing explicit statewide vision.
Yeah. And then
without
we're in a major period of transformation and transition, right? So trying to name anything specific at this moment in time would probably, yeah. Hey, John,
Yes.
I'm really sorry. And this may be something for the letter. So we can all collectively say, Jill, we're going to put this in the letter. Could you go back up to the special fund?
Yes.
Okay. I have a technical question here. Number 1, awarding aid to school construction projects under blah, blah, blah. That coupled with the approval down below, in your opinion, is that language flexible enough to contemplate something that I've talked about previously, but I think we just haven't had enough time to wrangle with, which is potentially a 2-track for grant awards. One that is like payment of debt service on big local bonds, and the other is potentially something like grants for smaller scale, like infrastructure system life cycle replacement. Yeah, Martine, I see you shaking your head, and I think that while one is general enough, but with all the detail that's down below, it doesn't allow for that kind of flexibility. Is that, John, am I right there?
That's right. You would have to build into 3445 additional tracks, which I would
Yeah.
say is the natural place to do it. If you think about the new piece that's added here, emergency aid, that's also done under 3445. It's just done under a different subsection. So if the idea is to have a dual track thing, you could create within 3445 an additional track, but it would need to be spelled out because these are meant to be specific uses that flow through with particular subsections to make clear funds only for these very specified purposes and ensure that it's not just broadly used for operation of the program.
So it needs to be called out in this language, right? Yeah.
Sorry. I don't believe we ever contemplated any direct grants other than the emergency aid. Is that correct, everybody? And this is like a big pivot shift.
Well, it's not. I brought it up multiple times. So, but I think we just didn't have time to really dig into what was meant here. So, for example, Bob brought up a really good example of like system life cycle replacement for sprinklers, right? That would not necessarily, it's not a major renovation. It wouldn't be a $15 million project. So I had raised this idea of what do we do with these kind of smaller projects that will actually extend the life of our existing buildings, still have all of the same requirements for eligibility and how we prioritize, but would allow buildings that are not undergoing major renovation, but would allow those buildings to extend their life cycle. It might just be something that we need to like hold and put in the letter, but it is something that I brought up several times because it's a real need. We have a lot of smaller scale projects that would be able to extend the life of our buildings.
Okay, yes, you did bring them up. For me, a sprinkler system is an emergency. I mean, is this all about defining?
Not under our emergency construction rules. It's not. It's if your sprinkler system is currently functioning but cannot be replaced because it's obsolete, then it in no way would meet the requirements for emergency construction. The only place, I think, Bob, if you're there, you can weigh in, is if literally the fire marshal came in and said, I'm shutting this school down because your sprinkler system is not working, right? So it would not meet the requirements of construction, emergency.
Follow-up question, Jill, are these smaller projects not something that local districts can budget for? Knowing that they have an ancient sprinkler system, can it not be added to their budget? Because they know their buildings, right? Probably better than anybody.
So we have real world examples of this, right? Roof replacement, HVAC replacement, sprinkler system replacement. No, those could be, let's say, $4 million projects, $5 million projects. So the question is, do we have, I just want to signal that there are a whole host of small projects that the state might say that's a worthwhile investment in order to extend the life of these buildings so that deferred maintenance does not become major construction or we don't tear the building down. So,
Okay, so non-emergent maintenance issues that will extend the life.
life cycle replacement. It's not even maintenance issue. It's not that they haven't maintained their system, it's that their system has reached the end of its remaining useful life or is beyond it.
So folks, is this something we want to add to this draft, or is it something that we would like to place on the list for the committees to dig into? And I'll let Dave speak, and then I think Alice wants to say something too. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the fact that in the draft bill, isn't there a cap, like a lower cap and an upper cap on some of these projects? And that, that alone is a kind of a filter to determine whether the AOE needs to consider one of these projects for bonding purposes. There's already like a funding cap, isn't there? Like 50,000, and then another one is 100,000.
There's an emergency aid cap, which you'll see at 100K, which is what was in the existing program.
Yeah, I think that's appropriate, unless I missed something.
These projects would not qualify as emergency aid. Emergency aid is, oh no, it's January, our boiler just exploded, we can't have kids in the room. So it's really emergency, like we've got to fix this, we can't go out for procurement, like bid, like we've got to get somebody in here. And that's what that program very specifically is for. This is contemplating something quite different.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Alice, go ahead.
Well, what Jill is talking about, this is your basic school construction. This is what they're going to be looking at, is their sprinkler system, their HVAC system, and their roofing. It's, that's kind of, in a way, a little separate from really trying to push them into consolidation or whatever. They've got to keep some of these current buildings going. Is that the intent of the special fund being used for those projects as well? And if it is, and what we're looking at for the special fund, it would only be paying a portion of that debt service for the local school district. So they would have to go out to bond for doing an upgrade to their sprinkler system. And then this fund would pay a portion of that bond payment to the district.
I'm gonna let Aaron speak. I just think we're in a slightly precarious place, just because if we make these grant awards to schools who have leaky roofs or whatnot, and then a year later they decide they're going to move to a different building, it just seems like, no, Jill's shaking her head. Go ahead, Jill, then Aaron.
So what we're contemplating here is that they would have to meet all of the same eligibility criteria as a building that's doing an $80 million renovation, right? So all the same prioritization metrics, they have to have the facilities master plan. So getting in the tent, there's all the same kind of gatekeeping, and it's like the big system replacement, right? Like replacing a roof every 25 years can be millions of dollars, right? So it's those systems, but we would say that is a building that we want to continue. And if we don't address those issues and support those big costs, we will end up with the leaky roofs that then end up with the mold problem that then ends up closing the school building and becomes emergency.
Trying to keep us aware of time. Go ahead, Aaron.
I think that this is something we have to push to the legislature, because this is really, like, again, kind of the meat of it. Like, is this the program to keep everybody going, or is this, and the special fund in particular, are we talking about some transformative, some moving towards a more consolidated at scale 21st century buildings system, and we won't be able to fund it all. We aren't going to be able to fund enough of any of it. What parts and in terms of what the work of the commission points to, you know, everything that's sort of going to happen in the next few years, where are the places really that we need to put the money? So I'm hesitant to add any more here, but this is in many ways some of the meat of the conversation that's going to happen during the session.
Agreed. We can queue it up as a question to go into the letter. So yeah, I think it's something that needs to be chewed on. And
Feel free,
carefully.
Jill, if you can send me a little language of exactly how you want us to sort of start that, but I've got the essence here of what we're
Awesome.
wrestling with.
Thank you, everybody. John, you want to go ahead?
Sure. I appreciate the outcome because I'm certainly not prepared to add language on this dual track program in the next 20 minutes. So we were talking about the approval and funding process. We've talked about the considerations that go into this. The new language that you see here, this is a new eligibility condition, is what we discussed last week, to say that if a project did not fulfill one of these particular needs, which they have to meet this subsection 1 for approval, if they didn't meet any of these needs, deterioration, excessive energy use, inadequate to provide programs required by law, etc., there would be an alternative track that if the project results in consolidation of 2 or more school buildings and will serve the educational needs of students in a more cost-effective and educationally appropriate manner as compared to individual projects constructed separately, this would be a condition that they could meet. If they didn't meet those other need fulfillment conditions, they would still need to meet the rest of the eligibility conditions that are spelled out. But this is the new piece to ensure that those consolidation projects can meet the approval process here. And I see a question.
Yeah, I had no question on the insertion of that new paragraph. I agree with it completely. My question, I'm going to go backwards 1 paragraph. And it looks like on your page, it's page 10. No, don't scroll. Page 10, it's the CC. It's the excessive energy use resulting. Let's see, where are you? Anyway,
Yep.
It's the excessive energy use resulting from the design of a building. I think that the reality is that the majority of our school buildings right now are fossil fuel serviced. That this draft in this particular paragraph is trying to solve too many problems. That this particular sentence dilutes the focus on the students and the academic facilities support that we're all trying to resolve, and that by putting in this reliance on fossil fuels or electric space heat, it takes us down a different path and dilutes our funding. And now I'll be the first one to submit that we need to keep a focus on this. But I think this particular paragraph could simply be altered to read the excessive energy use resulting from the design of a building, period. And that be one of the discussion criteria for determining priority. But that the focus on fossil fuels alone as one of the problems is not appropriate for this particular committee. And that's
Alice, do you have a comment in this vein to follow up?
Yes, this is current statute. And this is what the previous school construction dollars went to. A lot of our schools that were built in the 60s depended on electric heat, space heat, that was not sufficient. And they have converted over to biomass, and the state construction project paid for that. So this is current statute.
I get that, but just because it's current statute doesn't need to mean that we have to support that same initiative. Again, my point is the focus needs to be on the facility and the students, and not necessarily on the type of energy that we're using at the moment. There's lots of initiatives to shift that energy focus to non-fossil fuels. I just don't think it's necessary in here to tie the hands of the AOE in how and when they spend money school renovations and builds. Anyway, I just wanted to make sure that we're focusing on the right problem and we're not trying to solve too many problems with one bill. I'll
Well,
leave it at that.
focus for us is money, and excessive energy use is very expensive. So I would submit that we keep it.
Well, that's my point, Martine. I'm recommending that we keep the language that it says excessive energy use resulting from the design of a building and drop the words and reliance on fossil fuels or electric space heat. That's my point. I agree with you, but I don't think we need to solve all of the fossil fuel problems with this bill. We need to solve the problem with, providing quality education facilities for our students.
I
That's
agree
my
with
point.
that specification that Dave has in there. I think that moves us from the past program to the future, and energy use is always a huge part of budgets.
Alice?
Well, I just want to make sure we're looking what would be eligible in that preliminary application. So if a school district wants to move off of fossil fuels or move off of their current electric space heating system, and we don't have that language in there, would it still qualify for school construction dollars under the
So the
special fund?
Yep, the way that it could still qualify is if it met one of the other conditions in AA, BB, or DD, or if it had excessive energy use that resulted from design of the building. Now, whether design of the building contemplates designing a building that's reliant on a kind of fuel that might contribute to excessive energy use, I don't know. But there are other things that could be picked up. The thing that would drop out, that would no longer be eligible under the program if you cut that language, was if you had a facility that didn't threaten health or safety, that wasn't inadequate to provide programs required by law, that wasn't a deteriorating existing building, and did not have energy use issues attributable to its design, that program would no longer be eligible for state funds if it was simply trying to shift to a new kind of energy system. That's what you would lose if you drop that language.
So that's a real policy decision that will have to be made.
Yeah. I would leave it as is for now.
Okay, I just want to go on record as saying that that dilutes our focus and it's not necessary, but we'll continue.
Thank you, Dave. Go ahead, John.
Sure. Did folks have thoughts on the consolidation language? I know that the discussion last time was purely consolidation, and this language, additional language about serving educational needs in a more cost-effective and educationally appropriate manner, is just language that I brought in from elsewhere to ensure that consolidations that's happening is meant to be appropriate to its conditions, that is, that it's educationally appropriate as compared to doing those separately, and that it's more cost-effective. Does the group agree with those conditions or feel comfortable with this alternative eligibility condition?
I agree with it. Yeah, sometimes I'd like to change the word serve to enhance, but that might be too optimistic. So I'm fine with just leaving it as is.
So other eligibility conditions that have been discussed in previous meetings: needs can't be addressed reasonably by other means, proposed type, size appropriate, achieves the level of proficiency in the school district quality standards.
Yeah, if I can ask a question here, it's on the sentence that John just brought up. It's the proficiency in the school board or school district quality standards. I'm wondering, I need to understand the implication here. Is this particular sentence carving out a segment of our state education system by putting in the word proficiency? And what's the intent here?
Go ahead, Jill.
Jill can answer this one. Dave, this is a direct reference to the district quality standards, which are already in statute. The agency has already developed these and are rolling out in July 1 of 2025. We are specifically using proficiency as a way to describe those standards. So there are proficiency scales that take each of the standards and break it down into a description of quality. So the idea here is that we are using an existing requirement, right? So not creating a parallel anything, actually integrating with what already exists. And the idea is that anyone who is going to be eligible must at least have a level of proficiency, and proficiency, whenever possible, refers to a specific statute. So are they meeting the law, the requirements of the law in doing X, Y, or Z? We can talk more about it. I'd be happy to share that, but this was very deliberate in bringing alignment on a lot of different requirements and saying, if you're coming into the tent, you must at least be proficient in these district quality standards. And it's things like, do they have a 5-year capital plan to ensure that they have a plan for maintaining their buildings? Yeah.
Jill, I
So-
understand all that.
Yep.
I don't need a review of district quality standards. I'm asking if they're dropping in the word proficiency, let me be very specific. Are we purposely trying to alienate the independent schools by this particular phrase, proficiency? Okay, that's my question.
And it doesn't even refer to
If you're
independent schools.
confident
Not
that-
even, they're not
This
eligible.
isn't like this isn't a targeted,
No.
okay, very good.
It's
Thank you.
reusing the language that we're already using, basically.
The next eligibility condition is that the applicant has completed that facility's master planning process, meeting particular conditions. We have our priorities language at the bottom of page 11. And as noted before, the new responsibility language that you see above tasks the agency with rulemaking specific to this prioritization methodology that's in alignment with the legislative intent discussed. A few updates, just small updates on page 12 to the request for legislative appropriation. This calls out the specific committees that would recommend a legislative appropriation to be the education committees.
One quick question, if I could, back on page 11, unless approved by the Secretary for good cause to advance commencement of construction. My question is, if a district is going to fully fund a project, this sounds like they still need AOE's permission to proceed. I'm not sure if you could comment on that.
Sure. Yeah. Only if they're trying to receive state aid. And the place to look for that is the start of this section, which talks about a school pursuing a project and requesting state aid, basically. So this statute does not prevent someone who's wants to bond on their own from doing any kind of project they would like to do. Yep. So ed committees for the legislative appropriation recommendation. I think the discussion last time too was that inevitably committees are going to take this up. People are going to be invested in looking at this. The substantial highlighting that you see for final approval for construction aid, this is pulled directly from existing statute. So this is not something that's been discussed as to what the conditions are. This is just a default option for saying this is going to be a two-step process. These particular conditions have not been discussed in advance of today. This is just using existing language as the default. I would expect, as many other pieces, this is something that would be debated, but this is making clear to any committee that this goes to come session that the application process debated includes both a prelim and a final. But I'm happy to walk through the particular language here if you would like to go in detail. I'm just trying to be sensitive to time constraints.
Yeah, I would suggest, Dave, unless it's really targeted, we're running out of time. We have till 10:30 and we still are getting.
I'm very targeted.
Okay.
I'm very targeted. Okay, so at the bottom of page 12, what I have is C, paragraph C. Yeah, there you go. I'm wondering what the intent of that sentence is at the very end about any high school pupil living in an area prescribed, blah, 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 who may attend. What's the point of that sentence?
I honestly am not familiar enough with this space to say. This is just what's done in existing law, but I'm not in a position to explain. And that's kind of why I tried to give the upfront disclosure. Like, this is not a reflective section. This isn't a section that reflects deliberations of this group. This is a placeholder to make clear that a final application is contemplated. And it matches exactly what's in 3448. So if there are questions come session as to why this is here, to me, that's the simple response is placeholder language for final.
Can Jill comment on that? 'Cause it kind of looks like a pro-choice, you know, I don't know what the intent is.
I think if I could just say one thing, Dave, again, you missed this discussion that we had.
I didn't miss the discussion. I just wasn't on visual. I was listening to the whole thing.
We did talk about, I think, what the intent here was, and Jill, correct me if I'm wrong, but we want to be flexible in the way we're thinking about regions when we contemplate this work, correct?
So this is actually a holdover from the original program. And there was very specific technical language that had to do with this. I'd actually need to go back and review and understand why this very specific language was put in there. So my recommendation is to leave it and then ask the question, unless Alice, you remember why it's in there. But I do, there was a very specific step that had to be taken. It's a holdover from an earlier program. And I don't know what the intent was, to be honest, but I know someone who does, and I can ask her.
Okay, then I guess we leave it for now and dig into it at a later date.
The only thing that it might pertain to is a student who's being homeschooled. Because I know we did homeschooling carve-outs quite a while back.
Is Beth still on the call? Could she chime in, or is she gone? There's Beth. Hi, Beth. Do you have any insight?
Hi, Beth, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Counsel. I've been multitasking, so could you point me to the direct line in question or language in question?
This is line 11. Providing a grant for a high school is conditioned upon agreement of the recipient to provide high school instruction for any pupil living in that area who may elect to attend the school.
And what's the question? I'm sorry.
Just what is the intent behind this? This is something that exists already in law in the existing school construction program. If you happen to know the thinking behind why this was included in the first place, or the problem that it's trying to target.
More clearly, was this intended as a school choice type of initiative? I just don't understand.
I will just say I have several favorite phrases. And one of my favorite phrases is, I cannot breathe intent into this language. That is your job. I also did not draft this language. I believe Rep. Emmons is correct in that this language is in current law. And so John and I would have to actually go to the Secretary of State's office and do some research on the legislative history involved with this specific language. So I don't think anyone on this call today can answer what the legislature was thinking when they enacted this language. What I will say is, regardless of what the intent is, we do not have school choice in Vermont outside of high school choice and the specific law that applies to that. So even if there was intent when this language was drafted, it's a moot point because that is not a legal thing in Vermont. So I would say I don't know what the intent was with this language, but I don't know.
I have a question out to probably the only person who can answer it, but she is in another meeting and I can't pull her right now. So I have the question out. I actually have a vague memory that it had to do with athletics, but I cannot remember the specifics of it. So I'm going to ask that we just hold. I'll see if I can run down an answer within the time we have, and otherwise we just leave it in at this point, and then we can discuss it in session.
I think that athletics piece is connected to the homeschooling piece because it was allowing students who homeschooled to participate in athletics as well. And I think this is where the connection is for that language. So I do have another question, not pertaining to this, but it's on line 15 through 17. District shall not be reimbursed for debt incurred due to borrowing of funds in anticipation of aid. So this language pertains to if the state didn't come through with its school construction dollars, the state was not going to pick up the district's debt that was incurred on the state money that didn't come through. So this isn't, I know this is current language, it's going to be looked at, but that really doesn't work in the concept that we're working in at this point.
That's interesting. The way that that's super helpful context. The way that I had read this is to ensure that folks aren't brute forcing the application process. That is just submitting their applications and beginning construction, that you would have to go through the full approval process. But it sounds like you're saying this is meant to capture something broader, and apologies
Yes.
again for Jeff's overhead.
Is this meant to capture essentially, I think I'm misunderstanding, like grandfathering? Because I think that's another thing that's, you know, going to come up on our, what about somebody who's, if something were to happen a year before all this gets started or something, is there any look back? Is there any, you know, we know some people are already asking that. Or
They will.
Grandfathering will definitely have to be
sitting in one.
addressed. The thing I would say though on this specific language is that folks who did projects before a program was even contemplated were not doing that in anticipation of aid. So technically, I wouldn't actually think that this language prohibited it, but that will be a live question, grandfathering. But I appreciate the comment, Rep. Emmons. I'm not sure if there's appetite to do something with this today, or again, if kind of what I was trying to say is that this final approval section is a placeholder text. So next big piece here, award of construction aid. Base amount of award shall be 20% of the eligible debt service cost. Projects are eligible for additional bonus incentives as specified in rule for up to an additional 20% of the eligible debt service cost. I don't know that a ceiling was settled by the group. I do recall the floor of 20% being agreed on. I just included 20 as a placeholder here. It's kind of natural to mirror the base amount, but happy to hear if folks would like this changed.
I would like to keep it as is, as the floor, unless we want to go potentially lower, because I think that the ceiling, the increases are in the incentives and the things that might go, that might bring somebody above 20%, but it's, and that's clearly not fully worked out in this bill, but that's some of the really important work that will happen as a consequence of it.
And then to call out the technical piece here, what is eligible debt service cost? Use kind of a mathematical formulation here just to get at the idea of approved costs versus total costs. So the way you would get at that eligible debt service cost is you would take the lifetime cost of the bond and you would multiply it by the percentage of the project that the approved cost accounts for. So that's this eligible debt service cost of a project means the product of the lifetime cost of the bond authorized for the project and the ratio of the approved cost of a project to the total cost. So it's creating a percentage. Let's say it's 80% approved cost of a project. You would multiply that by the lifetime cost to ensure that you're picking up interest payments on that debt service. And then what would be paid is 20% plus any bonus incentives on that eligible debt service cost. So this is just a simple way of pulling in the concept that's been implicit background to all the discussions thus far.
And John, does this address the suggestion Chris Rupi brought up in our last meeting about this is sort of the language he was pointing towards about how we address the debt service payment schedule?
Yeah, we had, I think the key thing was just to make concrete so that come session, the debt service subsidy model was embraced.
Okay.
Definitely, I think it's worth building out more, but I think this makes quite clear that that is the direction this committee was heading by calling out eligible debt service costs. Another alternative I had thought about was tweaking the special fund language to specify that instead of awarding construction aid under 3445, that it could be something to call out debt service subsidies. But if you pick up the debt service subsidy language here, then it flows through to that special fund language. The last piece here is emergency aid. And again, this is just a holdover from existing law. Notwithstanding any other provision, Secretary may grant aid for a project deemed to be an emergency up to a maximum total project cost of $100,000. And just to call out, and this came up in the discussions previously, that 100K figure is an older figure that comes from existing law, and there may be considerations of raising that figure. Last piece is here, the appeal process if a district is aggrieved by a decision. And then the transfer of rulemaking authority, which is ensuring that there's no gap, that those state board rules transfer to the agency of education, which will have the opportunity to change them to implement other rules, but just to ensure that there's at least a groundwork for proceeding with the program. And that's the entirety of the draft.
Wonderful job, John. Thank you so much. Was there a question there at the end as to whether or not we wanted to change that amount from 100,000, or was that kind of rhetorical at this point?
My question is, are we intending that those dollars for emergency aid would be coming out of the special fund? Or keep it
Yes.
currently? Okay.
Yes, that'd be coming from the special fund.
So process question, if no one wants to weigh in on that last bit, do you need to redraft this with, I think there was at least one fairly substantive change that we made, and then bring it back to us for a vote?
So I see two ways to do this. There's one more time efficient way, which is I think they're agreed changes, and I can walk through them right now to say what they are. And if there's agreement that you would like to vote pending these updates, which are, I'll describe them in a narrow way so I don't have room to vary from them, I think that we could accomplish this in the next 10 minutes. If you actually want to see the draft, it's going to take more time than that. And I fear that people are going to need to step away and might not be available for the vote. So I could just walk through what I take to be the directives. And this would be a vote on the draft as making these updates.
Yeah, folks, can you give a thumbs up if you're okay with that plan that John just outlined? Great. And Dave, do you have a question?
I do. Before we drop off the topic entirely, I'm just curious from an AOE perspective, if there needs to be any language written in here about any supplement to the AOE staff to actually execute this program. And does it need to be part of this draft?
Yeah, I mean, do we need to actually identify the number of positions, or will that come with the appropriation? It's a good question.
Well, it's completely silent. And do you want it to be silent, or do you want it to be active?
So the AOE is tasked with administering the program. The special fund identifies that money will be appropriated for that. I think that if any situation arose where there was an expectation that the agency would not have appropriate staffing, then we would strongly oppose the bill, which we don't want to do. So we've identified that we need a minimum of 3 full-time positions that do not include Bob. And we're not double duty on that one, in order to implement this program. So it's a good point, Dave.
Well, if you're saying that you will not be able to implement this program unless you have 3 additional
minimum of 3 staff. Yeah.
It makes sense, I think, to name that in the bill. I also think, it's not fully cooked yet, so it could change quite dramatically. And so I don't know
how about
to proceed with that.
how about words to the effect of that AOE is also responsible for determining the staff necessary for the implementation of the program? Something to that effect, where we're not saying that it's 3 people or what have you, but that they need to come back to the table with a realistic estimate on how many people it takes, what staff it takes to implement the program.
And
That
what,
should be one of their responsibilities.
yeah, what I would expect to see added to this bill by the time it's passed, and what you would hear me say, would be, a section at the end that, says in order to implement this bill, 3 positions are created at the Agency of Education, and then the appropriate appropriation would exist in the big bill. So
How
I would
about,
expect that in the course of the conversation, you all would say to the agency, and how many people do you need in order to implement this thing that we've designed, right?
okay, Joe, can I recommend we just put it as a line item in the letter that AOE
I was gonna say, I
needs?
feel like it's something for the letter. Yeah.
Wonderful. John, why don't you go
Yeah. A thorough letter.
ahead and take us through the changes so then we can vote.
Sure. So the first update is to the statement of policy. I will screen share again just so we're very clear on what's happening. Encouraging efficient use of funds, and then we have these set of prioritization points: cost, geographic accessibility. There's a request to update from 21st century learning standards to 21st century education facility standards. The second piece is collecting and maintaining a clearinghouse of prototypical school plans. This is an AOE responsibility, adding as appropriate to this language to ensure that it's not required if all the projects end up being renovations. There's an additionally request to change instances of K through 12 to pre-K through 12 throughout. That'll have to check for conforming changes. For the advisory board membership, sorry, trying to find the relevant language here. Here we go. Members that are appointed by the speaker and by the committee on committees, adding language to the effect that legislative members are prohibited, and I can draw standard language that's used for this task. I think that's actually the extent of the complete agreed changes that I heard. I have other notes from this, but I think they resulted in additions to the letter. So the changes are 21st century education facility standards, adding as appropriate to the prototypical plans requirement, ensuring that pre-K through 12 is referenced throughout, and making clear that legislative members are prohibited from the advisory board.
That is wonderful. Thank you, John. I have taken note of those as well. So if there are no further questions or comments, we can go ahead and take a vote on this final quasi-final draft. Any other comments or questions? Bob?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Well, to say the least, this has been a very heartfelt and educational discussion this morning. And me being kind of on the outside looking in, I've heard the pros and the cons, and I'm in a position now where I would vote to approve the recommendations to move to the jurisdictions of committees, or the committee's jurisdictions. However, my one caveat is that I don't necessarily approve any additional funding at this point in time for additional positions, knowing the state that we're in here in Vermont as far as educational taxes and so on and so forth goes. But I would vote when it comes time to move this forward, but not necessarily with the addition of any new positions until we know more about that. Thank you.
Thank you for those thoughtful comments, Bob. I appreciate that. And I think we're all in agreement that will be fleshed out in committee. So thank you very much for that. With no further comments on the table at this moment, I think we can, Alice?
You need a motion.
Oh, Alice, would you like to make a?
Yes, I would move that we vote favorably on, and I'm not quite sure, John, how to phrase this, because you're on draft 4.1 now, and we're going to amend that
Right. I
So,
think if you say 4.1 pending
As
agreed
amended?
edits, yeah, as amended, yeah.
so I move that we vote out favorably draft 4.1 as amended.
Great. I have a motion. Is there a second?
I'll
Send
second.
Weeks. Thank you for that second. Okay, great. Well, all in favor of adopting 4.1 in its future amended form, please raise your hand. Okay, great. Looks like it's a 7-0 vote in favor of adopting draft 4.1 in its future amended form. Thank you, everybody.
So before we go, this is a drafting request, John, that you're going to carry through on behalf of the senators on this committee as well as the House members?
If that's how folks would like to proceed, I wasn't sure if particular members wanted, but I'm happy to do it in that way. If it's just everyone who's participated do a Senate request and do a House request.
Because we have to do a drafting request, right?
Yes.
That works for me.
But what chamber does it first pop up?
It would be
It-
in both chambers, and then it would be up
So-
to the committee chairs of those two committees to figure out who's going to do the work first, I would assume. I don't know.
Okay.
And then in terms of the letter and the long narrative of things that were not decided are still complicated, et cetera, I'll put together a draft of that by the end of next week and just send it in legislative email to everyone here. And then feel free to send me edits, additions. It's not meant to be a like formal document that says but a guiding document for the committees of jurisdiction and to help us essentially have our notes going into the session. And so we'll bounce it back and forth, and it's possible maybe it won't actually get finalized until we're in session. But that's fine. We won't need it until we're actually in session, but I'll get a draft out in the next week or so here when I pull all this stuff together.
Much for staying on top of that and I could tell you were keeping great notes the whole time. So thank you very much. And we will gladly help make edits or, we'll weigh in, I'm sure. So thank you for that. Do I have a motion to adjourn? Jill?
Just very briefly, if as folks are contemplating this and walking away from it, if you are thinking of, as we're all going to be going in and being asked to speak to this, if there is information, research, data, more resources that would be supportive of your own kind of thinking around it, please feel free to reach out to myself and Bob. We've got entire libraries of resources in our own files for this. And this question came up and I don't understand what it means, or I think I've been talking to my colleagues and nobody understands X, Y, or Z and we need to talk about it. Let us know. We're really happy to prepare. We're always happy to help educate so that we have informed conversations.
Jill, you just brought something up that triggered something for me in terms of before we adjourn. How will we message the work that we've done out to the commission as well as the pre-K study group? I think that's really important. Is there a mechanism for that? Should one of us be invited to those groups to give testimony or any thoughts? I think it's important that they get this information ASAP.
Yeah, so I think, yes, I actually very much agree with that, Martine. I would be happy to jointly go with any one of you into those sessions. I'm listening to them anyways. I might as well be. So Aaron and Martine, that might just be reaching out to those chairs and just saying, hey, we have an update here. We'd be happy to share with you. And I would be happy to ride along with anyone.
I will do that today. I will try to get an email out. I'll CC, I can CC this whole group. But yeah, I will do that. I think it's really vital we do it soon. So I'll get it done today. Is that cool with everyone? Great. Okay. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Alice Emmons, thank you. And Senator Weeks looks